They never expect the master of the skies. Hey guys, Dov here, and I've got it on pause just because I was admiring Tiktaq'to's unit model here. He looks really good. I don't know if I've ever actually looked at his unit model up close like this, but here we are, Felcon's Lizardmen. This is from the qualifier once again. A lump of replays he sent me. It's Tiktaq'to. Yes, in a high-level tournament game against the Tomb Kings. So let's take a look at the builds here and see what's going on. Tiktaq'to himself we'll come back to. Pterodon Riders, got a whole big line of Saurus Warriors, quite strong in this matchup. Scarvet on foot, a couple Feral Stegodons, Red Crest, Cohort of Sotek, Skink Priest, Lore Beast, one Clever Girl, and yeah, that's basically it. For the Tomb Kings, we've got some Skeleton Archers, including the Regiment of Renown, I believe, yep, Sepulchral Stalkers, one Ushabti Greatbow, some Skeleton Warriors, Tomb Guard with Halberds, protecting the flanks, and skeleton spears around the back. So, Tiktaq'to, let's get back to him. The Master of the Skies. What does he bring to the table? Well, he is relatively cheap, flying-only lord. You do not have an option to take him on the ground, and you strip him of all his abilities, and he's got some decent utility, or cheapness, I should say. His abilities are okay, especially if you expect an air-to-air engagement. Even then, though, his low HP pool means that if you get bad RNG rolls, he'll still just die in an air-to-air fight. He can win some interesting fights against more expensive lords and heroes, but his main thing here is that he's cheap and mobile and does some nice armor-piercing, good charge, just like pretty decent stats, not amazing, but he's there and he's flying and he's cheap and does AP. And in this matchup specifically, Ushabti Greatbows and the Sepulchral Stalkers as well are pretty big threats for the Lizardmen, and his mobility, his fast speed, allows him to get back and pressure very efficiently, so we'll watch for him to do that here. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Tiktaq'to, his low HP is really his biggest downside, and I'm probably going to talk a lot about that. I've probably mentioned it several times, but here he's just kind of chilling back. Gets a Manticore summon up in the air, of course, very appropriate for a Lizardman kind of Pterodon air-themed build. Pterodons are now moving in as well to probably do some drop rocks, or even just fight in melee against some of these ranged units. Try and tie down the Sepulchral Stalkers. They can't use their gaze attack too efficiently, but the box collapse is real, and there are always going to be gaps. Unless the units are literally stacked on top of each other, but a nice just mass drop rocks here. Tiktaq'to himself already dives down here and is fighting tooth and nail against the Sepulchral Stalkers. He's got to be a little careful. Again, too much bad RNG and he can take damage very, very quickly. But Sepulchral Stalkers, the basic ones, don't have the most attack in the world. Only, what, 22 attack with an okay bonus versus large of 18. So they'll be hitting for a decent amount of attack there. But Tiktaq'to with 50 melee defense can shrug off quite a few of those. Especially with the support of this Stegodon now, the Clever Girls, Cohort of Sotek also moving up and in, and a second Manticore summon as the Pterodons then kind of form up over here and just start to focus fire on these Sepulchral Stalkers, where the Manticore also dropped down, so the Lizardmen almost putting on like yeah, an interesting kind of air rush here to help deal with these Tomb Kings range units, which can sometimes be threatening to the ground forces. But yeah, look at this, is exactly what Tiktaq'to you want to do in this matchup. Slapping Ushabti Greatbows around. It's quite the wild boy swinging around here on the ground in the sand. Feels very appropriate somehow. Got our Cliff Racers, Pterodons, fighting in the desert here against the Tomb Kings, just very appropriate. And I mean, Tiktaq'to starts out in this area of the world anyway, right? So it is actually pretty thematic in that sense from the campaign perspective. But balance of power still very close. Tiktaq'to working through some time here as the Saurus also kind of just grind down skeletons. Over here we've got the Summoned Ushabti trying to support the Tomb Guard with Halberds, but Saurus just trades so cost effectively with skeletons. Because of their high weapon strength, they can just beat them down into dust. Very appropriate for the kind of mallets that they carry, the little hammers, clubs, if you will. Cudgels, even. But Summon Manticore goes down. Pterodon's going to continue to swoop around to try and engage some of these units. Nicely done with these regrouped skinks getting up into the back line. tying up those skeleton archers, even if just for a moment. They are pretty spooky, so the skink cohort's going to run for the hills. Sad time. And a Tic-Tac-Toe as well, chasing the Shopty Greatbow. Not necessarily that they're running, they are tactically repositioning here, but using the Clever Girls in support as well. Two very underrated units. I have made a video in the past about the Clever Girls. Tic-Tac-Toe coming in with his little daggers. What does he have, 2 daggers, right? It's the one. I guess he's holding on with the other hand, which does make sense. Bit of a wild ride. Gonna have some more summons from Ark and the Black there. But at this point, he's just throwing skeletons into the sandy wind, into the dust, because Bound's power is starting to grind more and more in the Lizardmen's favor, as the Saurus and the Stegodons, which have taken a decent amount of damage here, but just the fact that the Tomb King's ranged units haven't really been able to fire consistently. Like, some of the ammunition's been used here for some of the archers, but many of them could not use their ammunition, and even for the Sepulchral Stalkers with their anti-large AP and melee, they still do often need to use that ammo to be cost effective, but yeah, Tic-Tac-Toe getting it done with that backline mobile pressure. And that really is what he brings to the table. I would say probably his best use cases are not even matchups where you have him fighting in the air. It's situations like this where you have him coming down to the ground to pressure a ranged backline. The tricky thing is that, like, the other factions you may want to do that against, he's a little bit too squishy to be effective. Like, Coast, Dwarfs can both take him out pretty quickly. He's very vulnerable to something like Harkon in the air, even though he can fight Harkon okay while his buffs are active. His low HP and lack of healing means he just gets crushed in the long run, unfortunately. And likewise, I believe Harkon's pistol also lowers physical resistance, I want to say. I'd have to double check that, but he does rely on that somewhat as well. I didn't talk about that, but well played to Falcon and Energize both. Very fun game. The Saurus definitely just crushing skeletons here. 144, 225, 74. Great stuff. 102 for the cohort of Sotek. Stegodon's also crushing some kills. Only 7 kills for Tic-Tac-Toe, but all 7 of those are high-value monstrous infantry, like either Sepulchral Stalkers or Shopty Greatbows, right? So that in and of itself is pretty good value considering how cheap he is. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and just talk about that. Tic-Tac-Toe, I mean, I guess you could kind of compare him to some of the horse combat lords, except that he is an air specialist, so there's not really too many exactly like him. Like, you can't select his mounts. He's on the Pterodon, and that's it. You can take Deadly Onslaughts, okay. I mean, he has 60 charge, which is decent, but given that you really want him to be as cost-effective as possible, you would generally, again, if you're not fighting in the air especially, cut both of these. And just 900 points for his basic kit, which gives you the Drop Sphere of Tepok. The enemies are slowed. It does a pretty decent little AoE splash. It's nothing really to write home about, but it is there. Focus Instincts also stops Rampage in an AoE, which can be nice. You have multiple kind of feral monsters fly over top and pop that, and they'll come back under your command. Doesn't give leadership, though, unfortunately, like Cold-Blooded does, which some would say is worse, but the AoE, you know, it kind of gives it some different utility. Not necessarily better or worse, although the extra leadership is nice. Plus 16 is pretty considerable from Cold-Blooded. I guess you could always take both, right? Take a couple, or at least one Skink Chief Bro to give that alongside Tic-Tac-Toe. He can even ride a Pterodon too. Gives some poison also. Tic-Tac-Toe, interestingly, does not deal poison in melee or anything. But, yeah, only 900 points. So, again, Skaven, it's going to be tricky. Snitch will destroy him, I think, because he has just so low of HP. Although I'd be curious if you can avoid getting charged by Snitch on the ground and charge Snitch from the air, you could maybe do some damage to him, because he himself is not, doesn't have the most HP in the world, but, I mean, Tic-Tac-Toe's only got about 300 more, so you'd have to pick and choose your engagements pretty wisely, and given that Snitch has just much better stats, he's got this snare ability, he can hide from you with his concealment bombs and everything. Slippery also makes him much faster and gives him extra melee defense. It's going to be tricky. But, I mean, obviously, Howling Warp Gale and ranged units are also a bit of a threat in this matchup. So sort of the Tomb Kings are probably one of the worst factions in the air, I would say. I mean, Carrion are a decent unit, I would say. They're probably one of the better flying units in the game, to be honest. At this price, they're kind of all you got, right? I mean, even if you're playing Followers of Nagash, you've got bats as well, but they're still more or less in the same unit class, that kind of low-tier chaff flying unit, right? More or less. And as such, they really don't have a lot of responses, direct responses to Tic-Tac-Toe, so I actually see him being pretty decent. Maybe meta? I don't know. If your opponent goes with a pretty heavy construct build, it could be hard for him to really operate because he's so squishy. But yeah, it's definitely, I kind of see, I see that to a degree. Greenskins is another one where they have barely any flying units whatsoever and don't have a ton of ability to control your flying units except for, obviously, Fungus, which is a giant issue, and Skarsnik's pretty common in this matchup, so getting forced down from the ground, or from the air to the ground is pretty painful, and just like Doom Divers, again, not super common in this matchup, but they would definitely be a threat. I don't know, maybe I would try them against the Greenskins, but Greenskins don't really have the same kind of monstrous infantry ranged, right? That's pretty unique to Tomb Kings, I guess. Interesting, though. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts. Definitely, I see him being viable and maybe even meta in Tomb King's matchup. I don't really see him working well in any other matchups, but I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts. And Felcon, of course, you can chime in as well if you are not... Not that I'm giving you permission. You obviously can do whatever you want, but you know what I mean. Let us know your thoughts if you end up watching this. Thanks again, guys. Be sure to subscribe, share, like, all that jazz, and we'll see you next time.